Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure of introducing you to a true powerhouse in the world of technology and software development. Meet Mr. Nick Proud, the head of software development at NexBotix and a remarkable tech content creator. But that's not all. Nick proudly holds the prestigious title of an MVP, which is a Microsoft Most Valued Professional, making him a recognized expert in his field. Today, we have the privilege of delving into the fascinating world of .NET and Azure development with Nick, as he shares his insights and experiences. So, before we begin, I would like you to picture something. Picture this: it's a crisp autumn morning, and the sun is just starting to cast its warm rays upon the bustling streets of a vibrant city. As the day begins, Nick Proud finds himself at the heart of a technological revolution. He stands in the center of a conference hall surrounded by eager developers, entrepreneurs, and enthusiasts from around the globe. The air is electric with anticipation as Nick steps up to the podium, ready to unveil the possibilities of .NET and Azure development. With a twinkle in his eye and an air of confidence, Nick begins to weave a captivating tale of how technology can shape the world. He shares an anecdote from his early days in the software development, where he encountered a company desperately seeking a scalable solution to handle their ever growing customer base. The traditional systems were struggling to keep up, causing frustration among both employees and customers. Driven by a passion for innovation, Nick took it upon himself to explore the untapped potential of .NET and Azure development. Armed with his expertise and a vision of creating a seamless user experience, he embarked on a journey to revolutionize the company's operations. With painstaking dedication, he architected a robust and scalable cloud based solution powered by the flexibility and reliability of Azure services. As the months rolled by, the transformative power of Nick's work became evident. The company's operations experienced a dramatic shift. The system effortlessly handled the influx of new customers, transactions were processed at lightning speed, and employees rejoiced as they bid farewell to the days of system crashes and downtime. This success story quickly spread throughout the industry, establishing Nick as a go-to expert in .NET and Azure development. Now, with a wealth of knowledge and real-world experiences under his belt, Nick Proud stands before us as a true luminary in his field. Today, we have the privilege of delving into the intricacies of .NET and Azure development with Nick, learning from his expertise and discovering the limitless possibilities that lie within the dynamic realm of technology. So, Nick, now I would like to invite you to speak a few words and then we will begin with the interview.
Yeah, thank you, Uzma. And I must say as well, I might invite you to do my customer introductions from now on because that was amazing. Thank you so much. I think my head's pretty big now, but
Thank you.
but yeah, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I work for a company called NexBotix in the UK, and we are a managed service provider for robotic process automation. So, I don't know if you've how familiar you are with RPA, but the big players are companies like UiPath, Automation Anywhere, and we provide a service with our own tech that we've built internally that provides an easy way to enter automation for businesses. So, historically, it would have been quite difficult for a lot of businesses to provision RPA because you'd have to buy expensive licenses, you'd have to stand up a center of excellence internally. But with NexBotix, we've been making it so that you can essentially extend your team with us, and you benefit from the fact that we use our own tech and we are able to charge sort of pay-as-you-go RPA. So we're on a bit of a mission at the moment, and it's fun, it's challenging, but .NET is at the heart of it, and so that's what keeps me going. You C#, .NET, Azure, I love it all.
Great, Nick. Thank you so much. So, without further ado, let us embark on this enlightening journey with Nick Proud as he shares his insights, experiences, and passion for .NET and Azure development. Now, Nick, for an icebreaker question for our audience, I have this one framed for you. Give me a moment. Okay, so What is your favorite feature or service in Azure and why?
Yeah. So there are so many different features, and they seem to change every day. But my favorite most recently has been Azure Form Recognizer. So that's part of the Cognitive Services suite. And what Azure Form Recognizer allows you to do is benefit from a whole set of machine learning models for documents. So, we're all familiar with ChatGPT. It's a large language model. But Form Recognizer is similar in the sense that it's a model for things like invoices, identity papers, passports, driving licenses, things like that. And what it means is, without having to train an AI, you can pass it a document, it will just know what kind of layout it is. So the use cases for this are abundant for document processing, which is the majority of the kinds of automations we do in NexBotix. So it's simply an API that we can call, and we then get access to this whole host of AI services. So I can just ingest a PDF and say to the API, here's a PDF, give me all the key points, and it will have invoice ID, vendor, line items without any training. And historically, OCR meant that you'd have to train every single layout. So what that means for us is that we can go to a customer and say, hey, you've got 500 vendors, they've all got different layouts. It doesn't matter. We're just going to process them. And there's still some rules that we have to put in to parse out some of that data. But Azure just returns a big block of JSON and says, this is what I found in the document. This is how confident I am. And straight away, we don't need to worry about having data scientists standing up our own models. We just consume the API. So from a convenience perspective, Azure Form Recognizer for me has been my favorite, I'd say.
All right, great start, I must say. So you would pick this any day over other things in Azure, right?
Yes, I think, I mean, that's so core to what we do, and it's heavily supported by more staple resources in Azure as well. So we're big
Hmm.
consumers of Azure SQL, Azure Blob Storage, and then for authentication, we use things like Azure Key Vault, and also we heavily use things like application insights for telemetry. So we're very, very much invested in Azure. It kind of is our operations center. It keeps us going.
All right. Moving on, could you explain the benefits of using dependency injection in .NET Core and describe how you incorporate it into your projects?
Yeah, dependency injection. So, aside from it being pretty much a main best practice for any C# developer, when it comes to ASP.NET in particular, you're going to be consuming lots of different resources. So the best example I can give for dependency injection is things like data sources. So Entity Framework does this quite well, where you can register a DB context. That's a connection to your database. And once that's registered once in the startup of your application, you can then just reference that or inject it into different controllers. So if you've got a controller which is sitting there receiving requests for customer information, you don't have to set up that SQL connection. You don't have to instantiate a new object of a context. You just have it there already. So it's um, like I say, it's a best practice, obviously, but the main benefit for me is being able to say once I'm registering this resource, and then I can inject it wherever I want to.
Perfect. Good to know. All right. So how do you utilize Azure Active Directory and Azure App Services to implement authentication and authorization in Azure?
Yeah, so this is a really cool feature. So authentication, it can be a real pain to implement. And the biggest piece of advice I would give that I've taken, in my experience is don't roll your own authentication. There's no point in writing your own because chances are you're going to miss something and you can't really compromise with security, right? So the way you can benefit from authentication with Azure Active Directory is you can use the identity framework in an ASP.NET app or another .NET application, and you can register that application in Azure Active Directory. So it's quite powerful when it comes to building bespoke apps for customers who already have all their users in AD, You can just register your app with them, and you can say, we'll need access to these specific resources, and it just goes, it just does it. It just connects everything up. So once you then fire up the app, you've got a login screen straight away. It's got the Windows login screen. You can log in with your Active Directory users, and it will specifically ask the user for permission to access those resources you've specified as well. So you can be very granular about the resources you want to access. We actually use it as well for some of our internal applications. So if you can imagine, we've got lots of different bots that are sitting on customer infrastructure, but we need to be able to see what they're doing. And we need people in our organization to log in and see that information in those dashboards. So we've implemented identity with Azure Active Directory, and that means that anyone in our organization can simply log into this application, and it doesn't matter if it's public facing, you have to authenticate via AD. So that's probably not the best explanation of how to implement it, but it gives you a sort of flavor of the possibilities with it.
So would you safely say that less manpower would be going here and it would be more automated?
Yeah, so it definitely cuts out a lot of development time, because you're simply configuring things in the Azure portal, and then there's a few bits of code on the app side. But in terms of implementing your own authentication, besides the fact that that's not as safe potentially, it's a lot of work. And so there are lots of other really good authentication providers, but the reality is most companies that we engage with, and you probably engage with as well, they're using Azure Active Directory, so it just makes sense to use this feature.
All right, moving on. Can you share some example of frequently used Azure services and probably explain how you monitor their performance and availability?
Yeah, so I can go for our most common services, which are um, Azure App Service and Azure SQL. So we can monitor both of those using a resource in Azure called Application Insights, and it's a very user-friendly telemetry tool. And the benefit of it is, aside from giving you the usual sort of analytics, traffic, request amounts, and all that sort of stuff, it's really good for debugging, because remote debugging isn't very easy in Azure still. And I think it's the same for any other cloud provider. It's a difficult thing to implement. So sometimes you do need to be able to track failures once they've been, failures in production. So the benefit of Application Insights is that you can simply say, I want to take a look at the failed requests on an app service. And if you've got any dependencies for that app service, so SQL, for example, most applications are going to have a database of some sort. You can track the request through to the endpoint and then see how it went down the layers of architecture. So if something failed in SQL as a result of a request into your app service, you can see that without having to set loads of links up. So, Azure already knows that you've got a link to your SQL database, so it automatically says it started here, ended up in your SQL database, and this was the specific query that it ran. And that's so powerful, because if someone's saying to me, I'm sending a request to your service, it's not getting through, and then I test it locally and it's working, I'm going to want to test that in production. Um, Obviously not changing anything in production, but I want to be able to monitor that in production. And having that seamless link is extremely beneficial.
I think this thoroughly says how seamless the entire process is, right? That's great. I mean, that's really great to know. Perfect. Great. Moving on. What are some of the challenges and trade-offs you encounter when working with .NET and Azure in hybrid or more or less like a multi-cloud environment situation?
Mm. Yeah, so remote debugging is still a challenge. It does work, but for me, it's not a go-to. It's a sort of last resort. I would much rather sit in Application Insights if I could. But if I specifically need to breakpoint some code, then I do have the option of remote debugging. But as I say, it's not the easiest, nor should it be. You're asking quite a lot of a compiler to read something in real time in the cloud locally. That's quite a big ask. I would say the other struggle you can have is largely around the multi-cloud environments. So, we in particular have um, automations that are bespoke and specific to a customer's use case. And a lot of those automations involve UI automation of their specific application. So they may have an application which is, something that they wrote in house or that was no longer was only available, 20 years ago. And we sometimes want to host the virtual machines for those robots in the cloud. But trying to match those up, trying to link those together is quite difficult because you need access to their applications, but you want the VM to be in the cloud. So sometimes that can be quite a challenge because you've got to try and build trust between networks, and having the virtual networks are great in Azure, but they're complicated. And so you do need to have a certain set of expertise sometimes to be able to manage those virtual networks in a way that they can easily communicate with a customer's network, for example. So wherever you've got those boundaries between cloud networks, that's a challenge, definitely.
All right. And if I may ask you, did you encounter any such kind of a challenge recently in 2023 or 22? If you could just tell us about that.
So a recent challenge that we had in 2023, um, I'd say it's probably related to those links between customer and internal networks, because we're trying very hard to capture a lot of telemetry um, from the bots that are running, but they're in the customer's environment. So very often they may have very strict rules and policies around firewalls, for example. So we've had to find a way to easily capture the data in real time. And so what we've instead tried to do is use the Azure SQL database to capture that data. And we're also looking at SignalR at the moment as well, which is a real-time technology, which you can use locally, but Azure actually have a managed service for it. So what you can do is you can say to your application, when something happens, notify this hub. They call them hubs. And with Azure SignalR service, those hubs are actually in the cloud. So you can notify something in the cloud, and then lots of different things can be triggered off of that. So we haven't implemented that yet, but it's on my radar because we need a generalized way to easily understand, well, not understand, to be notified of events that happen in sort of foreign networks, basically.
All right. So, next question for you. When designing and developing microservices using .NET and Azure, how do you ensure that there is scalability or perhaps resilience and security?
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously the point around security for me is the same as the one I made. It's, don't roll your own, use an integrated provider, Auth0 or something similar, Active Directory, obviously. Um, but I would say in terms of scalability, it is one of the hardest problems to solve because you don't always know what your volume is going to be. I would always assume that it's going to not necessarily explode, but have that in your mind when you're designing. So that all comes down to clean code and solid design principles. It's not as much around what you provision in Azure, because that can be changed quickly, but it's more scalability for me is more around the code that you write. So if you're writing code which is scalable, which can be extended, you're using object-oriented design principles, or you have developers in and you know that they're using those principles, to a certain degree, you're always going to have that scalability. You're always going to be able to extend. But at the same time, with microservices, when you actually publish them, I would say start small. You don't want to launch microservices thinking, right, day one, we're going to have 10,000 requests a minute. You just don't know unless you've got people actually waiting for that service. So start small but think big is probably the advice that I would give, and really look at the quality of your code design first. And then in terms of microservices themselves, you also need to ask the question, do we actually need microservices? Because it's a very sexy topic. It's quite fashionable to say, oh, microservices everywhere. Sometimes monolith is fine. I think Amazon recently went back to a monolith quite famously, which shocked the industry because they're a huge cloud provider. So once you get into the microservices conversation, I would always encourage teams to ask themselves that question: do we actually need this? And then if we do, start small but think big.
All right, great. You mentioned about Amazon going back through one of the models you said. Could you please specify that for us?
Yeah, so I think it was, I don't think it was AWS specifically, their site. I think it was the actual main Amazon site. I'll have to double check it, but Amazon did recently publicize quite heavily that they were going back to a monolith model for some of their services. So, big companies like Amazon, Google, they're the good use case, I'd say, for microservices because they have really widely distributed systems. But what I do see quite a lot is a lot of smaller companies or startups talking a lot about microservices, and it doesn't necessarily always fit the use case. So, if Amazon, a huge company, um, can make a monolith work, then it does beg the question, you know, should we jump into this as quickly as we think we should? That's definitely not a. I'm not an opponent to microservices because I use them. I do use them for certain scenarios, but they are very specific scenarios.
Lovely, great. Also, I couldn't help but pick the point where you said that if you need something, you ask your members or your teammates that is this something we actually need, and that gives me the feeling that you're a very laissez-faire kind of a leader, where you implement a lot of discussion or interaction, and you're not just taking all the decisions by yourself. That's great, actually.
Absolutely. You can't. I'm very careful not to be a dictator. It's very easy to just say, right, I've decided we're going to use this tech, go and use it. And then you've got a bunch of really unhappy developers, and you're probably not going to keep them for very long. You need to make it. It's the same in any team. You need to make it so that people feel heard. And I think if you've got a team of people who have opinions about architecture, it's a sign that you've got a good team, and you should nurture that, definitely.
All right, great, great, lovely to know. Um, how do you leverage Azure DevOps to manage your .NET and Azure projects, covering aspects such as source control, deployment, or something beyond?
Yeah, so Azure DevOps gives you a lot of flexibility in the way that you run your team essentially and manage your code. So you can either use one section of it. So you might say, I just want to use the source control, or I just want to use the issue tracking, or you can go all in and use everything. And we've kind of
Okay.
gone all in, to be honest. So we host our repositories in Azure repositories, Azure DevOps repositories. We have our issue tracking using the Azure DevOps work items. And we also manage our sprints in there. We use the analytics to figure out what our burn down is, how we're tracking through our sprint, our velocity. And we also have plugins that we use, like retrospective boards where people can drop post-it notes on to say what went well, what didn't go so well, what we learned. And one of my favorites, actually, that we've been using quite a lot is a plugin for estimation poker. So instead of just saying to everyone, okay, you're working on this item, how long is it going to take you? And then they just, pull
Mm,
an estimate out of their head. We actually simulate a game that, I used to play when we used to go into the office, because we're fully remote, called Estimation Poker. And that's where you get a set of cards which has a list of estimates, numbers on it.
mm,
And you say, okay, here's the feature, here's the bug, whatever the work item is,
okay.
and you give some overview of what's required, what the acceptance criteria is, and then everybody chooses an estimate based on
Mm,
their own personal understanding, but they place the card face down, and then we all together reveal the card. And so it means that it's a safer space for developers who may think, oh, I don't want to feel a bit silly, or I'm not really sure what to put.
About.
You just put the card in and then you reveal it, and then we talk about it. From that, we get to see, okay, you thought this was going to be 10 story points and you thought this was going to be one. What's going on? Okay, let's take a look at that. And so that's obviously difficult for a remote team to do, but thanks to that plugin in Azure DevOps, we've been able to simulate that, and it's worked really well, because then the estimate that we agree on goes onto the work item, which goes into the sprint, and then we can obviously link that work item to any branches that we do in Azure DevOps repositories. So yeah, we're all in on DevOps at the moment. There are some challenges from time to time, but we found usually when we come against an obstacle, there's a way around it. We just have to figure it out. So
Great. I mean, I really like that game of yours. At the back of my mind, I'm already thinking how I can use it and, kind of implement another game out of it. That's great, actually.
yeah,
That's great. I mean, lovely. Uh, uh, okay. So, how do you stay up to date with your .NET and Azure skills? Like, are you? I have always heard this quote, that people in technical field and education field have to always keep learning and upgrading themselves. So are there any courses you do, and what recent trends or innovations in this particular domain have caught your attention?
yeah. So I mean, it is definitely essential for any developer to stay up to speed. Um, I think it's even more so for me, because as you get more senior in a business, you code less. Um, so I'm still pretty hands-on, but it's less than the sort of everyday devs, and so there's even more of a reason for me to stay up to speed. Um, I think courses are great, um, but you need to stay hands-on as much as possible with your learning. So, my advice to anyone doing courses would be, don't just sit there and watch it. Code along. And most instructors, if they're good, they'll say the same thing. They'll say, I'm going to be writing a lot of code examples, but don't just watch me. Follow along in Visual Studio. The code will be available usually as well to download, or sample projects. Um, and I think having a YouTube channel as well massively helps, because it forces me to understand the tech. If I'm going to be talking about a specific subject, I need to know what I'm talking about. So, especially you're putting yourself out there, aren't you? You're coding in front of an audience, and that's pretty nerve wracking. So you want to make sure it's right. So I've kind of forced myself to stay up to date as a result of that. In terms of trends, I'd say the obvious one is AI. Everyone's talking about AI, and I think the trend of it's sort of upgraded the Googling experience, hasn't it? I've got some of my developers are coming to me and saying, I used to Google this, but I actually just asked ChatGPT what to do. Um, and I kind of applauded their honesty a little bit, because I think there's sometimes a little bit of a stigma around that. I think it's perfectly fine, because it's no different in a way to going on to Stack Overflow and asking a question. You're just not getting it from a human. So I think that's a huge trend in education. Um, and I think software architecture is a massive, um, well, a very fashionable subject. Whenever I look at content creators, it's which design pattern is best. I would definitely advise caution to junior developers, because you may get a lot of content creators who will say this is the best thing to do, or you shouldn't be doing this. This is the best way. At the end of the day, each business you work in could have different standards. So I would say be aware of these different design patterns, but don't take them as gospel. Understand that when you join a business, they may do things slightly differently, and you'll have to conform to that to a certain extent. So yeah, I'd say those are the biggest trends I'm seeing: design patterns and AI.
Great, perfect. Could you please repeat the word again, the one that you mentioned for content creators?
For tech content creators,
Yes.
yeah. So it's whenever I look at tech content creators on LinkedIn, YouTube, people like myself actually, you'll often see that they'll talk about design patterns, And they may sometimes say that this design pattern is the best one. So yeah, it's just about being careful that you keep an open mind, basically.
And also, I couldn't help but do a little laugh here when you mentioned about ChatGPT. I mean,
Yeah,
when it came initially, people were quite, I mean,
yeah,
they were just affected by it. But I guess at the end, we all are kind of having this view or point of view that, it's here not to take our jobs, but to make us better and to actually
absolutely.
question us.
Yeah, definitely keeps you good. If it keeps you accountable. If and you do have to embrace it to a certain extent. Because at the end of the day, if you just say, ChatGPT, write me a script which is going to do X. Well, it's going to do. It's not necessarily going to fit the use case. A QA person might come back to you and say, "Hey, you missed this edge case." And because the robot didn't know about that use case, so it's a tool, not a replacement. Not yet, anyway. We'll see.
Well, I don't know if you've done a video on this. You could definitely, whether AI is your replacement or not.
Yeah, maybe that's going to have to go on the list, I think.
All right, moving towards the last question. How do you see this is more of like a futuristic question, all right? So, how do you see the role of .NET in the future of cloud native applications, especially with the emergence of new technologies such as serverless computing, microservices, the ones you mentioned, and containers?
Well, it's evolving extremely quickly. I think the biggest, in my opinion, the aim of .NET was to provide choice in the language. This is sort of pre-Azure. It was kind of an answer to, or an alternative to Java, in the sense of, here's a general purpose programming language for Windows, and then it sort of developed into, okay, now we're cross-platform, we're open sourcing everything, and then Azure came along and provided all these different resources. And what we're already seeing is areas of the industry that you used to have to build yourself are now just wrapped in an API. And I think we'll simply see more of that in the immediate future. So, I think infrastructure as code will continue to um, be prevalent. At the moment, it's not as accessible as I would like it to be. I think I kind of shudder a little bit when I have to, potentially write a YAML file or something like that. Um, but I think it will be easier to write infrastructure as code in the future, because it will just become the norm. Um, I think automation will get better. So you can already spin up VMs based on logic, for example. But again, it's not as straightforward as you would like it to be. So I just think things will become more automated and more accessible in the cloud. And serverless is amazing to me. I think if you're looking to implement microservices, if you've had that conversation, you're still going to go forward, then I'd say Azure Functions is an absolute no-brainer, because it's so cheap and so scalable. We're already using it ourselves to optimize a lot of our web applications, with pre-processing, for example. So instead of loading data for a dashboard on page load, we pre-calculate it using Azure Functions. So I think you'll just see a lot of diversity of technology, and also a much more agnostic .NET, because it's already so compatible with things like Python, C++, Java. It doesn't really matter what language you write. It all plugs in. So yeah, I think that's the crux of it in terms of the future of .NET. It's more simplicity and more automation.
Nick, since you mentioned automation, I was also thinking that maybe if things get better with automation, perhaps we have more and more roles and designations coming up, things which we would have not even thought about, and perhaps humans and the manual work could be taken up to another level. I think there's more scope for intelligence and knowledge and people thoroughly upgrading themselves every now and then. What do you think?
Yeah, so it's kind of, I was watching a documentary recently about work. It was actually made by is produced by Barack Obama. Actually, it's a Netflix documentary, and they were talking about automation and AI and things like that, about how it will replace jobs, just as the invention of cars replaced horses. Didn't replace horses, but you know what I mean. um, and what he said in the documentary stuck with me. It was this idea of the knowledge worker. The knowledge worker is the lucky worker, because they will be more in demand. And that's why I think, software developers, people in tech, at the moment feel a little bit safer. They may worry about AI, but they do feel a bit safer because they still need that creativity, that ability to improvise, to analyze. And to your point, I think it will require people to upskill, and it will require people to be more educated. Um, and that to me is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that, as a society, um, we'll have to change the way we teach our kids. My little girl is about to start school, and they're already talking about teaching them how to program. Because they just have to learn this now. So you can guarantee that she'll start school and they'll start talking about using Scratch and then Python, and it's just the norm. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it will just require people um, to have a higher standard for education, which will be difficult for some,
Hmm.
but we just need to look at how we support those people, and how the education system as a whole is going to have to change.
It has to. I mean, if AI is developing, definitely it has to change. And since you mentioned about your younger daughter learning all these things, I also came across a course actually, which was um, kind of into the process of being, just laid out here in IB schools, International Baccalaureate Schools of India, wherein they were thinking of teaching students financial freedom and what
Mm.
money is and how could you actually use money. So I think this
Yeah.
just sums up to what we have just spoken. All right, I think that's it, Nick, from my side. I'm done with all the questions. Anything you would like to, conclude or summarize or just say in a nutshell?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation. I think we've covered quite a lot in such a small space of time. Um, but yeah, I'd say, don't be scared of automation. It's definitely a message that we try to convey at NexBotix. I think I work with a lot of customers, and a lot of those customers are people that used to do the jobs that we're actually automating. So it can be a bit awkward to start with, but actually, the message we're trying to say to them is, we're trying to make it so that you can do more interesting work. We're not trying to replace people. And so that's the message I'd probably like to leave with is, obviously jobs are going to change and some jobs will disappear. Um, but if people are adaptable and they're open to that change, then it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. I'd say that's probably the key message for, it's probably not .NET based. um, the message from .NET is obviously things are exciting, and in my opinion, Microsoft has definitely gone the right way, from the point when they started to open source everything, to obviously what they've done with Azure. In my opinion, it certainly provides more flexibility than, say, Google Cloud. AWS is having a good go. It's catching up. Well, it's we're not catching up. It's still the leading provider, but as a .NET developer, Azure for me is the clear choice because it just seamlessly integrates with everything.
Perfect. That's great. To our audience, I would like to say please stay tuned for upcoming webinars and meeting interesting people like Nick and many more MVPs coming up. Thank you so much, Nick. This was a lovely conversation. And I must say, I love your background, especially the small soft toy behind.
You know what? That was supposed to be my daughter's. It may have found its way into my office. It's a Nintendo character.
Then
Yeah.
that's quite relaxing for a person you are meeting virtually. I mean, that kind of relaxes
Yeah.
the person.
Yeah. You got to tread on the barriers, definitely.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers.